In July of 1996, a man crossed into the United States carrying thousands of dollars in cash and gold, convinced that someone was trying to kill him. Just a few days later, he would be found dead in a parking lot nearly 2,500 miles away. And to this day, no one knows what actually caught up to him. 31-year-old Blair Adams was a foreman for a construction company in Surrey, British Columbia, a job that required a level head and a steady hand. He was liked by his crew and respected by his bosses, holding a reputation for being a completely dependable guy. He was a recovering alcoholic who had been sober for 2 years, a milestone he took immense pride in. He was staying fit and seemingly looking forward to a long, productive future. But in the first week of July, that stability began to fracture. It started with a series of small, strange behaviors that caught the attention of his mother, Edith. Blair began showing up at his mother's house unannounced, appearing disheveled and wide-eyed. He wasn't under the influence of anything, but he was vibrating with an intense, internal static. He started telling his mother that people were following him, that they were coming for him, and that he didn't have much time left. When Edith pressed him for details, Blair couldn't give a straight answer. He just kept repeating that he was in danger. He stopped sleeping, spent his nights pacing his apartment, and eventually did something that signaled his life was officially veering off the tracks. He went to his bank and withdrew nearly all of his savings, nearly $6,000 in cash, and emptied his safe deposit box of his gold and jewelry. On July 7th, Blair drove to the Canadian-United States border. He was a man on a mission to disappear, but he was doing it with a level of frantic energy that raised immediate flags. When he reached the Peace Arch border crossing, guards noticed his erratic behavior and the massive amount of cash he was carrying. Given his state, they denied him entry. Blair didn't argue. He turned his car around, drove back to Surrey, and immediately went to a friend's house. He begged this friend to help him cross the border, claiming that someone was trying to kill him. When the friend refused, Blair went to a local car rental agency. After being turned down by the first, he managed to secure a vehicle from another provider. The next morning, Blair made a second attempt at the border. This time, he crossed on foot at a different crossing, and for reasons that remain unclear, he was allowed through. Once on American soil, he made his way toward the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. He was in a blind sprint, moving away from a threat that nobody else could see. He purchased a ticket to Frankfurt, Germany, a place where he had worked years prior and which likely represented a fortress in his mind. But then, for reasons that remain unknown, he never boarded the flight. He walked away from the gate, out of the airport, and back out into the parking lot where he had left his vehicle. He was no longer running toward a destination. He was just trying to get away. The movements of Blair Adams over the next 48 hours are a roadmap of pure, unadulterated paranoia. He drove the rental car to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, traded his Frankfurt ticket credit for a one-way flight to Washington, D.C., and upon landing at Dulles Airport, rented a fresh car and immediately began driving south toward Tennessee. At some point during the stretch, he traveled by bus, moving constantly and rarely stopping to rest. By the time Blair reached Knoxville, Tennessee, on July 10th, he was moving across the heart of America at a breakneck pace. Yet he never stayed in one place long enough to sleep. By the time he arrived in Knoxville, Blair was a ghost of his former self. He was exhausted and likely experiencing the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation. He pulled into a gas station and told the attendant that his car wouldn't start. The attendant checked the vehicle and found nothing wrong with it. The car was in perfect working order. Blair, convinced the car had been tampered with, abandoned it on the spot. He walked to a nearby hotel, the Comfort Inn, and walked up to the front desk. The clerk later described Blair as looking like a man who had seen a ghost. He was nervous and paid for the room in cash, but records indicate that Blair never actually used the room. He walked out of the hotel lobby and into the humid Tennessee night. Surveillance footage from a nearby business showed Blair appearing agitated and disoriented. He wasn't buying anything. He was just looking. He seemed to be checking the perimeter, watching the shadows, waiting for whatever he had been running from for over a week to finally emerge. He was 2,500 miles away from his home in Surrey, in a city where he knew absolutely no one, and he was standing in the middle of a parking lot as if waiting for a confrontation. The next morning, July 11th, a construction crew arrived at a site just a few miles from the hotel. As they pulled into the lot, they saw something lying on the pavement. It looked like a pile of clothes at first, but as they got closer, they realized it was a man. He was lying on his back, his shirt was pulled up, and his pants were unzipped. Some of his clothing appeared disturbed and out of place. Scattered all around his body was an incredible sight. Thousands of dollars in American and Canadian cash, gold coins, and jewelry. And then they realized it was Blair Adams. The man who had been running for his life had finally been caught, but the crime scene raised more questions than it answered. When the Knoxville police arrived at the construction site, they were met with one of the most bizarre scenes in the history of the department. Blair Adams was dead, but he hadn't been robbed. The money was found scattered around him, and his gold and jewelry were untouched. Whoever attacked him left everything behind. The autopsy revealed that Blair had died from severe internal bleeding caused by a blunt force injury to the abdomen. This was the result of a violent blow, so severe it caused severe internal damage. He also had minor injuries, including cuts and bruises, but nothing that clearly explained the fatal blow. Unlike someone who had simply collapsed, there were some minor injuries, but no clear signs of a prolonged struggle. The police began a massive canvass of the area, looking for anyone who might have seen Blair in those final hours. They talked to the hotel staff, gas station attendants, and the construction crew. They managed to track down a few witnesses who recalled seeing a man matching Blair's description, but the leads went nowhere. There was no one in Knoxville who had a reason to harm Blair Adams. He had no enemies there and no connection to the city. If the threat he feared back in Canada was real, it would mean he had been followed across a national border in several states, only to be intercepted in a random lot. As the investigation deepened, the police looked into Blair's life in Surrey. They checked his phone records and his associations, but found nothing. No one in his life was involved in organized crime, and there were no outstanding debts that anyone knew about. His friends and family were adamant that Blair's paranoia was a sudden, inexplicable shift. This led some to believe that Blair had suffered a sudden, late-onset psychotic break. They argued that the threat was a hallucination and that Blair's death was a freak encounter with a stranger. But the nature of the injury suggested a level of violence that was hard to attribute to a simple accident. The case of Blair Adams became a national sensation, appearing on Unsolved Mysteries and capturing the imagination of investigators. The central question remained: was Blair running from something real, or was he running from himself? If it was a psychotic break, it remains difficult to explain the physical reality of his death. A man in a state of crisis can certainly travel across a continent, but he cannot easily inflict a fatal internal injury on himself without a weapon or a fall from a significant height. Blair was found on flat ground. While some wondered if he had been hit by a car, there were no broken bones or road rash typical of a vehicular accident. One theory that emerged was that Blair had inadvertently stumbled into a dangerous situation during his frantic movements in Knoxville. Perhaps, in a state of heightened distress, he had approached the wrong person or entered an area where he wasn't welcome. In this scenario, his death wasn't the culmination of a week-long hunt, but a tragic encounter with a local stranger who reacted to Blair's erratic behavior with force. But this doesn't fully explain the unzipped pants or why the cash was left behind. It suggests the actions of someone who was perhaps just as disturbed as Blair appeared to be. The invisible pursuer theory remains a chilling possibility. It suggests that if the threat he feared was real, it would mean a group with the resources to track a man through multiple states had finally cornered him. In this version of the story, they didn't want his money, they wanted him. They struck him down in a way that left no trace of a weapon and vanished. This theory turns the entire week of Blair's life into a high-stakes struggle where every border crossing and rental car was a move in a game he was destined to lose. However, there is no physical evidence of these pursuers. There are no mysterious cars on the surveillance footage and no unidentified DNA at the crime scene. The only person seen on the tapes is Blair. He is always alone, acting as if the world is crowded with threats that only he can perceive. It is the ultimate tragedy, a man who fled across a continent to save his life, only to find his end in a place where no one knew his name. The construction workers who found him didn't see a foreman or a son. They saw a puzzle that would never be fully solved. Today, the death of Blair Adams remains one of the most baffling cold cases in American history. The Knoxville Police Department still has the file open, and every few years, a new detective takes a look at the photos of the cash scattered on the pavement. They look at the autopsy reports and the graininess of the surveillance footage, hoping to see a detail they missed before. But the trail has been cold for nearly 30 years. Blair's family in Canada has lived with the weight of the unknown, never knowing if their son was a victim of a targeted threat or a victim of his own mind. Blair's gold and jewelry were eventually returned to his mother, a hollow reminder of the life he tried to carry with him. There is no memorial on that construction site in Knoxville. It is now a functional part of the city, with people walking over the spot where Blair fell every single day. The story has become a staple of true crime lore, a cautionary tale about the fragile line between reality and perception. If Blair was having a mental health crisis, his story is a heartbreaking example of how the mind can create a reality more dangerous than any physical threat. If he was being followed, his story is a terrifying reminder of how vulnerable we are when we are truly alone. We will likely never know what Blair Adams was looking at when he peered out of that hotel lobby into the Tennessee night. We will never know if he saw an attacker or if he saw a reflection of his own fear. In the end, Blair Adams ran 2,500 miles to escape a threat, only to be found in a parking lot with his pockets full of money he couldn't spend. He was a man who tried to outrun a shadow, and when it finally caught him, it left him exactly where he started, a mystery that no one could solve. The construction site moved on, the hotel changed names, and the cash was gathered up, but the image of Blair running through an airport, fleeing a ghost, remains one of the most haunting images in the annals of the unexplained. And whatever Blair Adams was running from, it caught him anyway. On a freezing afternoon in January 1935, a tall, well-dressed man walked into the lobby of the hotel president in downtown Kansas City. He didn't look like your typical traveler. He had a large, distinctive scar above his left ear that caught the attention of the staff, and his ears appeared slightly cauliflower-shaped, like he had spent years in a boxing ring. When he approached the front desk, the clerk noticed something even more unusual. This man had absolutely no luggage. He wasn't carrying a suitcase, a trunk, or even a small bag. All he had was a black hairbrush, a comb, and a tube of toothpaste tucked into his overcoat pocket. He checked in under the name Roland T. Owen and requested an interior room on a high floor. He was very specific about that interior part. He didn't want a window facing the street. He wanted a room that looked out onto the building's enclosed light well. The bellboy, Randolph Probst, took the man up to room 1046. As soon as they stepped inside, Owen didn't do what most guests do. He didn't check the bed or look in a bathroom. He immediately went to the far corner of the room, sat down in a chair in total darkness, and just stayed there. He seemed incredibly anxious, his eyes darting toward the door every time he heard a sound in the hallway. He told the bellboy he was just passing through and was planning to head to another hotel the next day. It was a strange thing to say right after checking in, but the bellboy just brushed it off as another eccentric guest. However, the behavior only got weirder from there. The next morning, a maid named Mary Soptic came by to clean. When she entered the room using her master key, she found it was almost pitch black because the heavy curtains were drawn tight. Owen was sitting in the exact same spot in the dark. He told her to go ahead and clean, but mentioned he was expecting a friend to visit very soon. He called his friend on. While Mary was dusting, Owen got up, put on his coat, and left, reminding her to leave the door unlocked because Dawn didn't have a key. Mary finished up and left, but when she came back later that afternoon with fresh towels, the room was locked from the inside. When she knocked, a voice told her to go away, saying they didn't need anything. It wasn't Owen's voice. It was deep, rough, sounded much older. Mary assumed Dawn had arrived, but the vibe on the 10th floor was becoming genuinely unsettling. Other guests began reporting a lot of noise coming from 1046, describing it as a loud, aggressive argument between two men. At one point, a woman in the room next door heard a man's voice pleading, followed by a series of dull thuds against the wall. She considered calling the front desk, but figured it was just a typical hotel dispute. She had no idea that behind that thin wall, a young man was being systematically tortured. The hotel president was a place of luxury, but for the guest in 1046, it had become a literal trap. By the morning of January 4th, the situation in room 1046 had reached a breaking point. The hotel switchboard operator noticed that the phone in that room had been off the hook for hours. She couldn't get a dial tone, and it was blocking other lines. She sent a bellboy up to tell the guest to hang up the phone. When he got to the door, he knocked and heard a faint, whimpering voice from inside tell him to come in. The bellboy tried the handle, but the door was bolted from the inside. He yelled through the wood for the guest to open up. There was a long silence, and then that same weak voice whispered, "Turn on the lights." It was a bizarre, chilling response that made no sense. The bellboy decided to leave it alone, thinking the guest was just drunk. An hour later, the phone was still off the hook. This time, the hotel sent Randolph Probst back up with a master key. He hammered on the door, but there was no answer at all. When he finally unlocked it and pushed his way inside, the smell hit him first. It was the copper scent of blood. He fumbled for the light switch, and when the room flickered to life, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The man who had checked in as Roland Owen was on his hands and knees on the floor, about 2 feet from the door. He was completely naked. There was blood everywhere, splattered on the walls, soaked into the carpet, and smeared across the sheets of the bed. Owen had been bound with heavy cord around his neck, his wrists, and his ankles. The cords were tied together in a way that meant if he tried to straighten his legs, he would effectively strangle himself. He had been stabbed, strangled, and brutally beaten, and his skull had been fractured from blunt force trauma. Despite these horrific, fatal injuries, Owen was still conscious. He was staring at the bellboy with wide, glazed eyes. The police arrived within minutes and immediately cut the cords. They desperately asked Owen who had done this to him, who Don was, and why he was tied up. Owen looked the detective right in the face and whispered, "Nobody. I just fell against the bathtub." The detectives couldn't believe it. They pointed to the cords still hanging from his wrists and asked how he could have tied himself up. Owen just shook his head and repeated that he fell. He was protecting whoever had done this to him. He was rushed to the hospital, but he slipped into a coma and died shortly after. When the police returned to search room 1046, they found that the professional cleanup had already begun. All of Owen's belongings were gone. His overcoat, his tube of toothpaste, his black hairbrush, and his comb. Everything had been removed from the room. There wasn't a single piece of clothing left. The only things the police found were a safety pin, an unsmoked cigarette, and a small hairpin. It was as if the killer had tried to erase the man's entire existence from the room. The Kansas City Police Department was left with a body they couldn't identify and a crime scene with no physical evidence. They checked the name Roland T. Owen, but it was a total dead end. Nobody by that name existed in Los Angeles, and the fingerprints didn't match any criminal databases. For weeks, the body sat in the morgue, and the local newspapers started calling him the mystery man of room 1046. Eventually, the city decided they couldn't keep him in the morgue forever and made plans to bury him in a potter's field in an unmarked grave. But just as the funeral was about to happen, something very strange occurred. The funeral home received a mysterious phone call. The caller wouldn't give a name, but they told the funeral director that money was being sent to cover a high-end burial service for Roland T. Owen. A few hours later, an envelope stuffed with cash arrived via a special messenger. Along with the money was a request for a large arrangement of roses to be placed on the casket. The card tucked into the flowers was written in a delicate, feminine hand and simply said, "Love forever, Louise." The police set up a stakeout at the funeral, convinced that Louise or the mysterious Dawn would show up to pay their respects. They waited for hours in the cold, but nobody ever appeared. The case went completely cold for over a year. It seemed like the man in room 1046 would remain a ghost forever. But in late 1936, a woman in Birmingham, Alabama, named Ruby Ogletree was looking through a magazine that featured a story on unsolved mysteries. She saw a photograph of the man from room 1046 and nearly collapsed. She recognized the scar above his ear instantly. It wasn't Roland T. Owen. It was her son, Artemis Ogletree, who had left home at 19. He had headed out in 1934 to go on a road trip and hitchhike across the country. He was just a kid looking for adventure, but somewhere along the way, he had run into something much darker. Ruby was terrified, but also confused. She told the police that she had been receiving letters from Artemis for months after he supposedly died in Kansas City. The letters were typed and described him traveling all over the world, even going to Egypt. But there was one major problem. Artemis didn't know how to type. He had never touched a typewriter in his life. The police realized that the killer hadn't just murdered Artemis. They had stolen his life. They had been sending fake letters to his mother to keep her from reporting him missing, giving them over a year to vanish. The letters about Egypt and the Mediterranean were all a lie to cover up the fact that her son was already lying in a grave in Missouri. With the victim finally identified, the police were able to piece together Artemis's final months, but the more they learned, the less sense it made. Artemis had been staying at several different hotels in the months leading up to his death, always using different aliases. It seemed like he was being moved around, or perhaps he was running from someone. The focus shifted back to the mysterious Dawn. Witnesses at the hotel president recalled seeing a man matching that description, large, rough, and intimidating, leaving the elevator on the 10th floor right around the time the maid heard the arguing. Some guests even recalled seeing Artemis in the lobby with this man, and they said the young man looked absolutely terrified, following the man like a servant. The theory began to emerge that Artemis had been caught up in some kind of high-stakes criminal world, or perhaps he had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. The level of torture inflicted upon him in room 1046 suggested that his attackers were looking for information. They had tied him up and beaten him for hours, yet Artemis never broke. Even when the police found him dying, his loyalty, or his fear, was so great that he took the secret to his grave. He knew that if he talked, the people who killed him would find his family in Alabama. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting his mother. The letters to Ruby Ogletree provided a chilling look into the killer's mind. They were cold, calculated, and perfectly timed. This wasn't the work of a random street thug. This was someone with the resources to track a young man across several states and the patience to maintain a complex ruse for over a year. The anonymous funeral and the Louise card suggested that someone involved in the crime felt a bizarre sense of guilt or obligation to Artemis. Or perhaps Louise was just another layer of the deception, a way for the killers to mock the authorities one last time. The investigation eventually went cold again. Despite the identification of Artemis, no one was ever arrested for his murder. Dawn was never found, and Louise remained a ghost. The hotel president continued to operate, but room 1046 became a place people whispered about. It was the room where a young man was erased. The police files were eventually moved to the basement, and as the decades passed, the witnesses died off and the physical evidence was lost. The case of Artemis Ogletree became one of those stories that people tell when they want to talk about the absolute darkness that can hide behind a locked hotel door. Today, the mystery of room 1046 is considered one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history. It's a story that defies every attempt at a logical conclusion. If you look at the facts, they don't lead to a person. They lead to a shadow. Why would anyone go to such extreme lengths to kill a 19-year-old boy from Alabama? Why would they fake his letters for a year? And why, in his very last moments of life, would Artemis Ogletree look at a police officer and lie to protect the person who had just spent 48 hours destroying him? The most haunting part of the story isn't the violence. It's the image of Artemis sitting in that chair in the dark. For 2 days, he sat in that interior room, knowing that Dawn was coming back. He didn't try to run, he didn't call for help, and he didn't tell the maid what was happening. He just sat there in the shadows, waiting for the end. It suggests a level of psychological control that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Artemis wasn't just a prisoner of the room. He was a prisoner of his own fear. He believed that there was nowhere on earth he could go where they wouldn't find him. The hotel president was eventually renovated, and today it's a beautiful modern hotel. But people still ask about the 10th floor. They want to see the room where the man with no luggage checked in. They want to know if the light, well, still looks the same. There are no plaques for Artemis Ogletree, and his grave in Kansas City is still mostly forgotten. He was a young man who walked out of his front door in Birmingham to see the world and ended up in a nightmare that never stopped. In the end, the mystery of Artemis Ogletree is a reminder that we never really know who is staying in the room next to us. We don't know what secrets people are carrying or what shadows are following them. Artemis was a young man who tried to outrun a ghost, and in the end, the ghost won. He died in the dark, in a city where no one knew his name, leaving behind nothing but a safety pin and a mystery that will never be solved. And the person who sent those roses, the person who signed the card, Louise, they took the truth with them, leaving Artemis to wait in the silence of room 1046 forever. In the late 1970s, the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine was known for its rigorous standards and its commitment to producing top-tier physicians. Among the students in the class of 1983 was a man who would go on to become one of the most dangerous doctors in American history. His name was Michael Swango. Michael wasn't just another medical student. He was a former Marine who had attended Quincy College before enrolling in medical school. He was strikingly handsome, intensely focused, and possessed an almost military-grade level of discipline. On the surface, he was exactly the kind of candidate any hospital would be lucky to have. But as his residency approached, his fellow students began to notice a series of deeply unsettling quirks. Michael didn't just study medicine. He seemed obsessed with the process of dying. The first red flags appeared during his clinical rotations. While most students were anxious about patient outcomes and worked tirelessly to ensure recovery, Michael appeared strangely energized when a patient's condition worsened. His classmates began to notice a terrifying pattern. Patients who were stable or even recovering would suddenly take a turn for the worse shortly after Michael entered their rooms. It happened so frequently that his peers gave him a dark, whispered nickname, 00 Swango. They joked that he had a license to kill, referencing the James Bond character. At the time, it was treated as a grim piece of black humor among stressed students, but the reality was far more literal than anyone wanted to admit. Michael's academic performance was equally erratic. He was nearly expelled during his final year because he was caught faking patient checkups and forging progress reports. Despite these glaring warnings and a formal vote from the faculty that initially recommended his dismissal, Michael was allowed to graduate. The medical board didn't want the legal headache of a lawsuit from a former Marine. They gave him his MD, effectively handing a wolf the keys to the sheepfold. In July 1983, Michael Swango began his surgical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center. This was his chance to prove himself at a prestigious institution. But within weeks of his arrival, the Swango effect followed him. Nurses on the floors began to report a series of bizarre incidents. They would see Dr. Swango entering a patient's room with a syringe, and minutes after he left, that patient would suffer a violent, inexplicable seizure or stop breathing altogether. One nurse specifically recalled seeing Michael in the room of a patient named Cynthia McGee. Shortly after he walked out, the woman died. When the staff tried to raise concerns with the administration, they were dismissed. In the hierarchy of a major hospital, a doctor's word almost always outweighed a nurse's intuition. By the summer of 1984, the atmosphere at Ohio State had become one of quiet terror for those working closely with Michael. The hospital eventually conducted an internal investigation after several code blues occurred during his shifts, but the investigators were looking for incompetence, not malice. They concluded that while Dr. Swango was perhaps a bit eccentric, there was no evidence of foul play. However, they chose not to renew his residency. Michael didn't seem bothered. He simply moved back to his hometown of Quincy, Illinois, and took a job as an emergency medical technician with an ambulance service. It was a step down in prestige, but it gave him exactly what he wanted unsupervised access to people in crisis. In October 1984, Michael's behavior shifted from patient tampering to something even more brazen. He began bringing donuts and soda to his co-workers at the ambulance dispatch center. Shortly after eating the treats, his fellow EMTs began to fall violently ill. They experienced excruciating stomach cramps, nausea, and partial paralysis. One day, Michael offered to make a pot of tea for the crew. Within an hour of drinking it, 5 of his colleagues were rushed to the emergency room. One of them, suspicious of Michael's odd behavior, saved a sample of his own vomit and turned it over to the police. The laboratory results were a bombshell. The samples were laced with arsenic and ant killer. When the police searched Michael's apartment, they found a scene that looked more like a chemist's workshop than a home. He had high-potency poisons, books on how to kill without leaving a trace, and a collection of scrapbooks filled with newspaper clippings about horrific accidents and mass murders. Michael wasn't just a killer. He was a student of tragedy. He was arrested and charged with aggravated battery. In August 1985, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 2 before being released for good behavior. To the public, it seemed like the doctor of death had finally been stopped. But the medical community is a vast and often fragmented system. Michael knew that his name was tarnished in Illinois, but he also knew that many hospital systems didn't talk to each other. He began a calculated campaign to reinvent himself. He changed his name to Daniel J. Adams and began forging his credentials. He created fake letters of recommendation and a completely fabricated history that explained away his time in prison as a misunderstanding involving a legal dispute. He was betting on the fact that most administrators were too busy to do a deep dive into a candidate's background if their paperwork looked professional. In 1992, Michael's plan worked. Using his new identity, he secured a residency at Sanford USD Medical Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He moved to Sioux Falls and tried to play the part of a dedicated, humble resident. But the dark impulses that had driven him in Illinois and Ohio had not vanished. They had only been sharpened by his time in prison. Almost immediately, the pattern returned. At the VA hospital where he was stationed, elderly veterans who were expected to make full recoveries began dying in the middle of the night. The staff noticed that Dr. Adams was often the last person seen in their rooms, usually carrying a small tray of medications that hadn't been ordered by the primary physicians. The situation in South Dakota came to a head when Michael began dating a nurse named Kristen Kinney. Kristen was vibrant, intelligent, and deeply in love with the man she thought was a brilliant doctor. But as their relationship progressed, she began to suffer from mysterious, debilitating migraines and bouts of extreme nausea. She noticed that her symptoms always seemed to flare up after Michael made her a meal or gave her vitamin injections. Her friends and family were horrified by her physical decline, but Michael maintained a mask of a concerned, grieving partner. The facade finally shattered when colleagues and investigators began connecting the dots between Daniel Adams and the convicted poisoner Michael Swango. Around the same time, Kristen herself had grown deeply suspicious. She had been suffering from mysterious and debilitating symptoms throughout their relationship. These were symptoms that investigators would later determine were consistent with arsenic poisoning. Forensic tests eventually found arsenic in her hair after her death. She never got the chance to confront him. Kristen Kinney died before the full truth came out, and the circumstances of her death only deepened the case against him. The residency program, realizing they had a convicted felon on their medical staff, immediately fired him. But once again, instead of staying to face the consequences, Michael vanished into the night. Michael Swango knew that the FBI was now interested in him, so he decided to leave the country entirely. He understood that in many parts of the world, a Western medical degree was a golden ticket that few would question. He applied for a position at a mission hospital in Zimbabwe, using yet another set of forged documents. He portrayed himself as a selfless doctor who wanted to give back to underserved communities. In late 1994, he arrived at Neen Hospital in a remote part of the African bush. For the local villagers, he was a miracle worker. For Michael, it was the ultimate hunting ground. Ending Hospital, Michael was given almost total autonomy. He was one of the few highly trained physicians in the region, and he worked long, grueling hours. But the Swango effect was more lethal here than it had ever been in the United States. Patients began dying from sudden complications at an alarming rate. These weren't patients with terminal illnesses. They were people with broken legs, minor infections, or women recovering from childbirth. The local staff noticed that Michael would often visit the wards at night, long after the other doctors had gone to bed. He would carry a bag of equipment and tell the nurses he was performing special procedures that required total privacy. The breakthrough came when a local doctor named Vicambarero Masheva began to notice that the deaths only occurred when Michael was on duty. He began a quiet, dangerous investigation of his own. He searched Michael's private quarters and found a hidden stash of drugs that were not stocked by the hospital: neuromuscular blockers and potassium chloride, substances that, if injected improperly, cause instant cardiac arrest. Masheva also found Michael's journals, which contained graphic descriptions of how it felt to watch the life leave a patient's eyes. The local authorities were notified, but Michael had a sixth sense for when the net was closing. Before the Zimbabwean police could arrest him, he fled across the border into Zambia. Michael's run ended in June 1997. He was attempting to transit through Chicago's O'Hare Airport on his way to a new medical position in Saudi Arabia. The FBI was waiting for him. They didn't have enough evidence for a murder charge yet, so they arrested him for technical fraud related to his forged applications. But while he was sitting in a federal cell, investigators were working across 3 continents. They exhumed bodies in Ohio, New York, and Zimbabwe. They found evidence of lethal levels of potassium and other chemicals in the tissue of people Michael had treated decades earlier. In 2000, Michael Swango finally faced justice. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to the murders of 4 people in the United States, though investigators believe the true number of victims could be far higher, spanning 2 decades and 2 continents. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, the families of his victims spoke about the betrayal of the medical profession. Michael had used the very tools designed to save life to systematically end it. He had taken the Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, and turned it into a weapon. Today, Michael Swango is inmate number 08352-424 at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the most secure facility in the world. He spends 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, separated from a medical world he once terrorized. He remains one of the most prolific serial killers in history, not because of his physical strength, but because of his ability to exploit the trust inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. He didn't have to break into homes or stalk his victims in the street. They came to him, laid in his beds, and trusted him with their lives. The legacy of the Swango case led to massive changes in how medical credentials are verified. The Swango rule was unofficially adopted by many hospitals, requiring much more rigorous background checks and direct communication between institutions. The case exposed a terrifying vulnerability in the healthcare system: the assumption that a doctor is inherently good. Michael Swango proved that a white coat and a stethoscope can be the perfect camouflage for a predator who enjoys the silence of a failing heart more than the sound of a recovery. For the survivors and the families of those who died in the wards of Ohio State and the VA hospitals, the memory of Michael Swango is a lingering chill. They remember a man who was polite, professional, and seemingly dedicated, right up until the moment he reached for a syringe. Michael Swango didn't just kill people. He killed the sense of safety that people feel when they walk into a hospital. He was a man who wanted to be a god, deciding who lived and who died, only to find that in the end, he was just a prisoner of his own dark design. The 00 doctor finally ran out of time, leaving behind a trail of empty beds and a medical community that will never be quite as trusting as it once was. In the autumn of 1958, a 16-year-old boy named Ted Kaczynski arrived at the gates of Harvard University. He was a skinny kid with a shy demeanor and an intellect that moved at a speed most people couldn't comprehend. While his peers were preoccupied with the social hierarchies of the Ivy League, Ted was a ghost in the hallways of Sherman Hall. He had skipped several grades, which meant he was socially adrift among older students who viewed him as an oddity. He spent his nights in the library, diving into the most abstract branches of mathematics, seeking a kind of order that the chaotic world of human emotion couldn't provide. His professors recognized his genius immediately, but they also noticed a profound wall he built around himself. He didn't participate in the typical collegiate rituals of the late 50s. He didn't go to dances or join clubs. He simply existed in a world of numbers and proofs, a solitary figure moving through a crowded campus. During his sophomore year, Ted's life took a dark and permanent detour. He volunteered for a psychological study led by Dr. Henry Murray, a man who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Murray was interested in the limits of human ego and the effects of high-stress interrogation. Ted thought he was signing up for a series of intellectual debates about his personal philosophy. Instead, he was subjected to a brutal form of psychological breaking. He was placed in a windowless room, his physiological responses monitored by cold, clicking machines, while a law student sat across from him and systematically dismantled Ted's most cherished beliefs. They mocked his background, his intelligence, and his very existence in hours-long sessions designed to induce maximum humiliation. He began to associate the scientific method and modern technology with the degradation of the human spirit. By the time Ted graduated and moved on to the University of Michigan for his master's and PhD, he was a changed man. He was still a mathematical titan, solving problems that had baffled experts for decades. But he was becoming increasingly paranoid about the direction of society. He viewed the growing presence of computers and automated systems as a looming prison. He finished his dissertation so quickly and with such brilliance that his thesis committee noted it was likely the best they had ever seen. He was offered a prestigious position at the University of California, Berkeley, becoming the youngest assistant professor in the school's history. On paper, he was a success story of the highest order. He had reached the pinnacle of academia by the age of 25. But inside the bustling environment of the late 60s Berkeley campus, Ted felt like he was suffocating. He looked at the massive mainframes being wheeled into the engineering buildings and saw them as the harbingers of a global catastrophe. In 1969, without any warning or explanation, Ted walked into the dean's office and resigned. His colleagues were stunned. They tried to convince him to stay, offering him tenure and more research funding. But Ted had already made up his mind. He didn't want to be part of the machine anymore. He withdrew his life savings, which amounted to a few $1,000s, and began looking for a way to disappear. He didn't tell his parents or his brother, David, where he was going. He just drove north, eventually crossing the border into Montana. He was looking for a place where the sound of an engine couldn't reach him. He found a small, 4-acre plot of land in the town of Lincoln, nestled in the shadows of the Continental Divide. It was a rugged, unforgiving landscape filled with dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings. It was exactly what he was looking for. Ted spent the summer of 1971 building a 10 by 12-foot wooden cabin with his own hands. It was a primitive structure with no electricity, no running water, and no insulation. He lived on a diet of wild game, foraging for berries, and growing a small garden in the rocky soil. For the first few years, he lived the life of a true hermit. He spent his days mapping the surrounding wilderness and learning how to survive the brutal Montana winters, where temperatures often dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He kept a meticulous journal, written in a complex secret code he invented, detailing his thoughts on nature and his growing hatred for industrial civilization. He believed he had finally found a way to live outside the reach of the modern world. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since his childhood in Illinois. But the world wouldn't leave him alone. As the 70s progressed, the logging industry began to expand into the Lincoln area. Ted would go on long hikes to his favorite secluded spots, only to find them leveled by clear cutting operations. One afternoon, he arrived at a plateau he considered his sacred place a spot where he went to meditate and feel a connection to the earth. He found it crisscrossed with new roads and littered with the debris of construction crews. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and the sound of birds, was now thick with the smell of diesel and the high-pitched whine of chainsaws. This was the moment of no return. Ted realized that there was no way to go to. As long as the technological system existed, it would eventually find every corner of the planet and destroy it. He decided that if he couldn't hide from the system, he would have to fight it. His first acts of rebellion were small. He would sneak onto construction sites at night and sabotage the equipment. He poured sand into the oil tanks of bulldozers and used a hacksaw to cut through hydraulic lines. He even strung up thin wires across trails used by motorcycle riders, hoping to cause injuries. But these actions felt insignificant to him. The machines always came back, and the trees kept falling. He realized that to truly hurt the system, he had to target the people who were its architects, the scientists, the engineers, and the corporate executives. He returned to his cabin and began a new kind of study. He spent months researching chemistry and ballistics using old books he found in the Lincoln Public Library. He didn't want to buy any components that could be traced back to him, so he decided to build his bombs entirely from scratch. He used scrap metal he found at the local dump and hand-carved his own wooden trigger mechanisms. He spent hundreds of hours polishing tiny pieces of wood and metal until they fit together with the precision of a Swiss watch. He worked by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his hands stained with chemicals and grease. He was obsessed with making sure his devices left no forensic evidence. He didn't use commercial explosives. Instead, he mixed his own gunpowder from raw materials. He even made his own glue from boiled hooves and hides. By the spring of 1978, he was ready. He packed his first device into a handmade wooden box and took a bus out of Montana, heading toward the Midwest. He was no longer just a hermit in the woods. He had become a professional hunter of men. On May 25, 1978, a package was found in a parking lot at the University of Chicago. It was addressed to an engineering professor at another school, but the return address listed a faculty member at Northwestern University. This was a classic return-to-sender ruse. When the package was delivered to Northwestern, a security officer named Terry Marker was tasked with opening it. As he pulled back the lid of the wooden box, a small but violent explosion occurred. The blast sent splinters of wood and metal into Marker's hand and chest. It wasn't a lethal device, but the craftsmanship was chilling. The FBI was called in, and they were immediately struck by how unusual the bomb was. There were no fingerprints, no store-bought parts, and the explosives were a unique homemade blend. It was the birth of a mystery that would consume the Bureau for the next 18 years. A year later, another bomb appeared at Northwestern, this time in a graduate student's mail. The victim, John Harris, suffered minor burns and cuts when the device detonated. The bomber was gaining confidence. The FBI established a small task force under the code name Unabomb, which stood for University and Airline Bomber. They had no suspects and no clear motive other than a general targeting of technical institutions. The lead investigator at the time noted that the bomber seemed to have an obsession with wood. Every component that could be made from wood was carefully shaped and polished. It was as if the bomber was trying to send a message about the natural world, even through his acts of violence. But the investigators couldn't imagine that this was anything more than a disgruntled student or a low-level eccentric. Everything changed in November of 1979. Ted decided to escalate his campaign to a level that could have resulted in mass casualties. He managed to sneak a large package into the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444, a Boeing 727 flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. This wasn't a standard pipe bomb. It was a sophisticated incendiary device equipped with an atmosphere pressure sensor. The plan was simple and horrific. Once the plane reached a certain altitude, the change in pressure would trigger the device, causing a massive fire in the hold that would likely bring the plane down. Mid-flight, the passengers and crew were suddenly overwhelmed by a thick, acrid smoke filling the cabin. The pilots declared an emergency. When the cargo hold was opened, investigators found a smoldering mess. The bomb had malfunctioned, failing to explode but starting a chemical fire that had filled the aircraft with toxic fumes. If the device had functioned as intended, 78 people would have died in a mid-air disaster. The FBI realized they were no longer dealing with a nuisance. They were dealing with a high-level domestic terrorist. The case was moved to the top of the priority list. They began looking for anyone with a background in aviation or high-level physics, but they were looking in the wrong places. Ted was already back in his cabin in Montana, sitting in the dark, listening to the news on a battery-operated radio. He was disappointed the plane hadn't crashed, but he was encouraged by the panic he had caused. He began working on a new design, one that would be more reliable and far more deadly. In the early 1980s, the bombs became more powerful and more frequent. In 1982, a secretary at Vanderbilt University opened a package that sent her to the hospital with severe injuries. A few weeks later, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, was maimed by a device left in a common room. The FBI was pouring millions into the investigation, but they were chasing a ghost. Ted never stayed in one place. He would take multiple buses across several states just to mail a single package, often wearing a disguise and gloves the entire time. He was meticulous about his sterile lifestyle. He didn't have a phone, he didn't have a car, and he didn't have any friends. He was a man who had completely erased his footprint from society. The laboratory technicians at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. were baffled by the physical evidence. When they deconstructed the fragments of the Vanderbilt University device, they found that even the tiniest screws had been modified. The bomber was using a metal lathe to shave off any identifying marks or serial numbers from the components. He wasn't just building bombs. He was performing a meticulous erasure of his own existence. Investigators began to notice a pattern in the materials that defied explanation. Much of the hardware came from literal trash. He was using old pipes, scraps of aluminum, and even wood from discarded furniture. This made it impossible to track the origin of the materials. Usually, a pipe bomb is made from a galvanized steel pipe bought at a place like Home Depot, which has a specific threading pattern. This man was casting his own parts. He was melting down lead and pouring it into handmade molds in the middle of the wilderness. The level of effort required to do this was staggering. It suggested a person with an infinite amount of time and a pathological dedication to his mission. The FBI started to build a profile of a man who likely lived alone, had a background in hard sciences, and possessed a deep-seated grudge against the very institutions that had educated him. The psychological toll on the academic community was immense. Professors at major research universities began to look at their morning mail with a sense of genuine dread. At UC Berkeley, the atmosphere was particularly thick with tension. Diogenes Angelikos, a respected professor of electrical engineering, walked into a faculty common room on a Tuesday afternoon and saw a small, unassuming wooden box on a table. Thinking it belonged to a colleague, he moved to pick it up. The resulting blast didn't just injure him. It sent a shockwave through the entire campus. The Unabomb task force was growing, but it was also spinning its wheels. They were looking for a disgruntled worker or a failed academic, but they couldn't find anyone who fit the bill and had also disappeared from society. They looked at thousands of people who had been fired from tech companies or denied tenure at universities. But because Ted had resigned so cleanly and moved so far away into the deep woods of Montana, he wasn't even on their radar. He was a ghost living in a 10 by 12-foot wooden box. Thousands of miles away from the cities he was terrorizing. He was living on less than a few $100s a year, surviving on rabbits and parsnips, while the United States government spent millions of dollars trying to find him. In late 1985, the nature of the attacks changed. Up until this point, the bombs had been designed to maim and intimidate, but they hadn't yet caused a fatality. That changed in a parking lot in Sacramento, California. Hugh Scruton was a 38-year-old business owner who ran a computer rental shop. He was exactly the kind of person Ted Kaczynski loathed, someone who made a living by facilitating the spread of technology into the hands of the general public. When Hugh walked out to his car and saw a strange object near his tire, he did what any responsible person would do. He tried to move it so no one would get flat. The explosion was so violent that it was heard blocks away. It wasn't just a pipe bomb. It was a sophisticated device designed for maximum lethality. The death of Hugh Scruton changed the rules of the game. The FBI realized that the bomber was no longer interested in just sending a message. He was now actively seeking to eliminate people he deemed guilty of participating in the technological system. The task force was flooded with new resources. They began analyzing the wooden components of the Sacramento bomb with high-power microscopes. They discovered that the wood wasn't just any wood. It was often handcrafted from several different types of trees, including cherry and maple, polished to a high sheen. This was a bizarre detail. Why would a killer spend hours polishing a piece of wood that was designed to be blown into 1,000 pieces? It suggested a man who viewed his work as a form of dark art, a craftsman who took pride in the beauty of his instruments of death. As 1986 turned into 1987, the pressure on the FBI reached a breaking point. The public was demanding answers, and the media was beginning to criticize the Bureau for its lack of progress. The investigators were desperate for a break, and they finally got one in Salt Lake City. A woman working in an office building looked out her window and saw a man in the parking lot. He was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, but the hood was up, and he was wearing large, reflective aviator sunglasses. He looked out of place, moving with a deliberate, stiff gait. He placed an object behind the wheel of the car and walked away without looking back. She didn't know it yet, but she was looking at the most wanted man in the world. When the device exploded moments later, the witness gave a detailed description to a sketch artist. This resulted in the famous hoodie and sunglasses drawing. It was a double-edged sword for the investigation. On one hand, it gave the public a face to look for. On the other hand, it was so generic that it led to tens of thousands of false tips. Every man in America who owned a gray sweatshirt and liked to hike was suddenly a suspect. But for Ted, seeing his own likeness on the cover of Time magazine was a terrifying moment of clarity. He realized that his invisibility had been compromised. He retreated even further into the Montana wilderness, deciding to go dormant. For the next 6 years, the mail remained safe and the bombs stopped coming. But the silence wasn't a sign of peace, it was a sign of evolution. During the years of 1987 to 1993, the world changed rapidly. The internet began to take shape, personal computers became a household staple, and the technological system Ted hated was expanding at an exponential rate. From his cabin in Lincoln, Ted watched this progression through the newspapers he occasionally picked up in town. He saw his worst nightmares coming true. The machines were becoming more integrated into human life than ever before. He spent these years in a state of intense intellectual fermentation. He wasn't just sitting in the woods. He was writing. He was drafting what would eventually become his 35,000-word manifesto, a philosophical justification for his crimes. He also used this time to solve a technical problem that had plagued his earlier bombs: reliability. Some of his early devices had failed to detonate or had only partially exploded. He wanted his next campaign to be flawless. He spent months studying metallurgy, learning how to create his own custom threaded bolts and high-performance triggers. He was living a dual life. To the people in Lincoln, he was Hermit Ted, a strange but mostly harmless guy who rode an old bicycle and lived in a shack without a toilet. To himself, he was a revolutionary soldier at war with the future. He would spend all day in the library in town, taking meticulous notes on chemistry and engineering, then go back to his cabin and apply those notes to the construction of a new generation of explosives. The FBI, meanwhile, was losing hope. The Unabomb task force had been scaled back to a skeleton crew. Many agents believed the bomber had died or moved on to another country. The case was becoming a cold case, a legendary mystery that was taught in training seminars but wasn't expected to be solved. They had no idea that the suspect was currently living in a cabin that was clearly visible from the road, just a few miles from a busy national forest. Ted's ability to hide in plain sight was his greatest weapon. He didn't look like a terrorist. He looked like a man who had simply been left behind by the 20th century. He was a relic of a different time, and that was exactly why no one suspected him. In June of 1993, the silence was broken with a terrifying level of precision. 2 bombs were delivered on consecutive days to 2 of the most brilliant minds in their respective fields. The first went to David Gelernter, a computer science professor at Yale, and the second went to Charles Epstein, a renowned geneticist. Both men survived, but they were permanently changed. The bombs were much more powerful than the 1980s models. They were designed to destroy entire offices. The Phantom was back, and he was angrier than ever. The FBI immediately ramped the task force back up to its highest level, but they were starting from zero. They had a 6-year gap in evidence and a killer who had apparently used that time to become a master of his craft. The 1993 bombings were accompanied by something new: letters. Ted began writing to the New York Times, identifying himself as part of a group called FC, which stood for Freedom Club. He claimed that he was part of a larger organization dedicated to the destruction of the industrial technological system. This was a classic tactical move to make himself seem more formidable and to divert attention away from the idea of a single lone wolf. The letters were arrogant, intelligent, and chillingly logical. He told the FBI that if they wanted the bombings to stop, they would have to listen to him. He was no longer content with just killing. He wanted to change the course of human history. The FBI brought in world-class linguists to analyze the letters. They looked for regional dialects, specific academic jargon, and even the way the letters were spaced on the page. They realized that the author was likely someone who had been educated in the 1950s or 60s, given his use of certain outdated idioms. But even with the best minds in the country working on it, they couldn't narrow it down to a specific person. There were hundreds of thousands of people who fit that general description. The investigation was a massive haystack, and they were looking for a needle that didn't even want to be found. In 1994, the violence claimed its second victim. Thomas Mosser, an executive at a top-tier advertising and PR firm, was at home with his family in New Jersey when he opened a package that had been mailed to him. The device was so powerful it tore through the kitchen and killed him instantly. Ted targeted Mosser because he believed the man's firm was responsible for manipulating the public into accepting the technological status quo. It was a cold-blooded assassination of a man who was simply doing his job. The level of fear in the corporate and academic worlds reached a fever pitch. People were afraid to touch their mail. Companies started installing expensive X-ray machines in their mailrooms. The Unabomber had successfully held the entire country hostage. The final murder occurred in April of 1995. Gilbert Murray, the president of the California Forestry Association, was killed in his office in Sacramento. This was a return to the scene of Ted's first fatal bombing 10 years earlier. It was a grim full circle. Shortly after the Murray bombing, Ted sent his ultimatum. He sent a massive manuscript to the Washington Post and the New York Times. He told them that if they published his manifesto in its entirety, he would permanently cease all terrorist activities. It was a demand that put the United States government in an impossible position. If they refused, more people would die. If they complied, they were giving a platform to a mass murderer. The debate over whether to publish the manifesto went all the way to the Oval Office. The director of the FBI and the Attorney General met with the publishers of the newspapers. The journalists were concerned about the ethics of printing a terrorist's work, but the FBI argued that it was their best, and perhaps only, chance to catch him. They hoped that the document's very specific ideas and writing style would be recognized by someone who knew the author. They were betting that the Unabomber's ego, his desire to be understood, would be his downfall. On September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the 35,000-word document as a special supplement. The manifesto was a dense, rambling, but often highly articulate critique of modern society. It touched on everything from psychology to history to physics. Millions of people read it. Most saw it as the work of a madman, but some found the logic strangely compelling, even if they abhorred the violence. In a small town in upstate New York, David Kaczynski and his wife Linda sat down to read it. They had been worried about Ted for years. He had become increasingly erratic in his letters to them, expressing a deep hatred for his parents and for the world in general. Linda was the first to notice the similarities. She told David, "This sounds like your brother." David didn't want to believe it. He remembered Ted as the brilliant older brother who had taught him about nature and science. But as he went through the manifesto, he saw specific phrases that he remembered from his childhood. He saw the way the author obsessed over the same themes that Ted had ranted about in his private letters. The realization was agonizing. David spent weeks in a state of paralysis, torn between his loyalty to his brother and his responsibility to the innocent people who might be next. He finally decided that he couldn't live with the blood on his hands. He hired a private investigator to act as a go-between, and eventually, the information made its way to the Unabomb task force. The FBI took the tip seriously, but they had to be careful. They didn't want to alert Ted. They sent a small team to Lincoln, Montana, to conduct surveillance. They saw a man who looked like a wild animal. He was unkempt, his clothes were rags, and his skin was dark with soot from his wood stove. He lived in a shack that was barely larger than a prison cell. It seemed impossible that this man, who lived without a phone or a car, could be the mastermind behind a 20-year campaign of high-tech terror. But when they checked his records and saw his background in mathematics and his history at Berkeley, the pieces began to fit together with terrifying precision. On April 3rd, 1996, the FBI decided it was time to move. They knew Ted was armed and that his cabin was likely booby-trapped. They didn't want a shootout or a standoff that could lead to his suicide. They used a clever ruse, sending a local forest ranger to the cabin door. The ranger told Ted that they were having a dispute about the property lines and needed him to come outside and look at a map. Ted, ever the stickler for rules and boundaries, stepped out onto the porch. As soon as he did, two agents who had been hiding around the corner grabbed him. He was a small man, weighing barely 140 pounds, and he was easily overwhelmed. As they took him away, other agents began the task of searching the cabin. What they found inside was a physical representation of a shattered mind. Every inch of the space was filled with stuff. There were thousands of pages of handwritten notes, most of them in code. There were jars of chemicals, piles of scrap metal, and, most chillingly, a fully constructed bomb under his bed, addressed and ready to be mailed. It was a time capsule of hate. They found the original typewriter he had used for the manifesto and the gray sweatshirt from the 1987 sketch. There was no doubt anymore. The 18-year hunt was over. The trial was a media circus, but it never actually went to a full jury. Ted's lawyers wanted to use an insanity defense, arguing that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Ted, however, hated the idea of being labeled insane. He believed his ideas were perfectly logical and that he was a rational actor fighting a legitimate war. He attempted to fire his lawyers and even try to hang himself in his cell. Eventually, he agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 8 life terms without the possibility of parole. Ted Kaczynski spent the rest of his life in the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. He was housed in a small cell, similar in size to his cabin in Montana, but made of concrete and steel instead of wood. He continued to write letters to people all over the world, becoming a cult figure for some radical environmental groups. He died in June of 2023 at the age of 81. He had wanted to save the world from technology by using the very tools of destruction that technology provided. In the end, he became exactly what he feared, a component in a system that had categorized him, studied him, and eventually locked him away forever. If you lived in Anchorage, Alaska, back in 2012, there's a good chance you would have run into a man named Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the U.S. Army, and by all accounts, a master at his craft. He was a self-employed carpenter, and if you needed a deck built or a kitchen remodeled, Israel was the guy you called. He was quiet, he was professional, and he stayed out of everyone's business. Neighbors would see him every morning taking his young daughter to school, looking like every other dedicated father in the neighborhood. In a place like Alaska, where people really value their privacy and their independence, Israel fit right in. He was the kind of person who was just there, part of the scenery. Now, most people who do the kinds of things Israel was doing, they have a pattern. Usually, they have a type of person they target, or maybe a specific neighborhood, they keep going back to. It's almost like they have a comfort zone. But Israel didn't. He didn't hunt people. He hunted for the perfect moment. For over a decade, he was essentially a ghost moving through the lower 48. He would fly from Anchorage to a massive airport like O'Hare in Chicago or Hobby in Houston, rent a generic car, and then just drive. He would go for thousands of miles, crossing 5 or 6 state lines, into places where he didn't know a soul. He never used a cell phone, he never used a credit card, and he never targeted anyone he had even a remote connection to. But there was something else, something that made him different from almost any other predator the FBI had ever tracked. Long before he ever chose a victim, Israel would go on what he called vacations. He would hike into remote state parks, walk through old, overgrown cemeteries, or find quiet trailheads in states he hadn't even worked in yet. Once he found a spot that felt truly isolated, he would dig. He would bury these ordinary orange Home Depot buckets deep in the dirt and seal the lids tight. Inside, he packed everything he'd eventually need: weapons, silencers, zip ties, and tools for disposal. He'd even stashed thousands of dollars in cash he'd stolen from bank robberies just to fund his future trips. He would leave those buckets there for years. That way, if he ever got pulled over while traveling, his car was completely clean. He was playing a game of chess against the world, and for 10 years, nobody even knew it was his turn. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet corner of New England that had never even heard his name, Israel's long-term planning was about to become a reality. It was June of 2011, and Israel had just finished a 2-day drive from Chicago to the green hills of Essex, Vermont. He didn't have a map with a red circle on it. He didn't have a name. He just had a mental checklist. For several nights, he lived out of his rental car, slowly trolling through middle-class neighborhoods after midnight. He was looking for a very specific house. It needed an attached garage so he could get inside without any neighbors seeing him. It couldn't have a dog that might bark, and he didn't want any children around. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a tactical advantage. Eventually, he found a modest home on Susquehanna Court. This was the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier. They were hardworking, well-liked people who had lived in Essex for years. Bill worked at the local university, and Lorraine worked in healthcare. They felt so safe in their community that they'd sometimes leave the garage door unlocked just to let the summer air circulate through the house. Israel watched them from the shadows of the tree line, sitting perfectly still, timing exactly when their bedroom lights went out. On the night of June 8th, he drove to a patch of woods nearby and retrieved a shovel. He dug up a Home Depot bucket he had buried 2 years earlier, checked his suppressed handgun and his zip ties, and prepared himself. He moved toward the house on foot, navigating the backyard with the silent precision of a soldier. He cut the phone lines first, and then he stepped into the garage. Inside the dark house, Israel moved through the hallways with a tactical flashlight and a weapon. He reached the upstairs bedroom and kicked the door open, catching Bill and Lorraine in a deep sleep. Before they could even process the fact that a stranger was in their room, Israel had them blinded by a high-powered light. He spoke to them in a terrifyingly calm, almost polite voice, telling them that if they just complied, they would be okay. He used the zip ties to bind their wrists and force them into their own car. He didn't want to finish this in a neighborhood where someone might wake up. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he had found during his scouting trips, a massive, decaying ruin slated for demolition, hidden behind layers of overgrown brush. Inside that freezing, hollow building, the Cayes realized that their compliance wasn't going to save them. Israel led Bill to the basement first. Bill tried to fight back, but Israel was younger, stronger, and he had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Once Bill was gone, Israel went back upstairs for Lorraine. He later admitted that he spent hours in that farmhouse, maintaining that same calm, clinical demeanor even as the situation turned into a nightmare. When the sun began to rise, he finished the job. He then used the tools from his kit to hide the remains deep under the debris of the farmhouse, spending hours scrubbing every surface with bleach. He abandoned their car at a nearby apartment complex, walked away, and flew back to Alaska the next day. In Vermont, the search for the Cayes became a national mystery, but with no forensic evidence and no motive, the case went cold almost instantly. By the beginning of 2012, Israel Keys had been operating in the shadows for over a decade, and that success had given him a dangerous sense of invincibility. He decided to break his own golden rule. He decided to hunt in the city where he lived. On the night of February 1st, the temperature in Anchorage was dropping well below zero and the wind was picking up. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was finishing her shift at Common Grounds, a tiny coffee shack sitting in the middle of a dark parking lot. It was a vulnerable, isolated glass box. Israel had been sitting in his car across the street for nearly an hour, watching her through binoculars. He knew she was alone. At around 8 p.m., just as she was turning off the lights to close, he walked up to the window. He looked like any other customer in a heavy parka. When Samantha opened the window to tell him they were closed, he produced a handgun. The security footage from inside the shack shows the exact moment the trap closed. Samantha's hands went up. Her expression shifted to pure shock, and within seconds, Israel had vaulted through the small window with terrifying agility. He forced her out the back door and into his vehicle, which he had parked in a dark corner of the lot. He didn't take her to a remote forest this time. He took her back to his own property, to a small, blue tool shed just feet away from the house where his girlfriend and daughter were sleeping. He tied her to a chair, and for the first time in his life, he began to lose his cool. He had originally planned to keep her alive for weeks to negotiate a $30,000 ransom. But Samantha wasn't a passive victim. She fought him, she challenged him, and she forced him to realize he wasn't as in control as he thought he was. In a fit of frustration, he abandoned his plan and ended her life that same night. But he still wanted the money. The problem was that he had a family vacation already booked, a luxury cruise to Mexico. If he stayed behind or acted strange, his girlfriend would become suspicious. So, Israel did something truly macabre. He left Samantha in the tool shed. Because of the Alaskan winter, the shed acted as a natural freezer. He locked the door, packed his bags, and boarded a plane. For 2 weeks, he was the picture-perfect tourist, taking photos of the sunset and eating at the buffet, all while knowing a young woman was frozen in his shed back home. When he returned from the cruise, he went straight back to the shed to finalize the ransom. He knew he needed a proof-of-life photo to convince the family she was still alive. He took Samantha's frozen body and sat her up. He applied makeup to her face to hide the grayness of her skin and give her a flush of color. In a detail that would later haunt the investigators, he used a needle and clear fishing line to sew her eyelids open, so she would appear to be awake and staring at the camera. He placed a newspaper from that morning in her lap to verify the date and took a Polaroid photo. He dropped the photo and a ransom note at a local park, instructing the family to deposit $30,000 into her bank account. The family, seeing the photo and believing Samantha was staring back at them, desperately complied. They scrambled to find the money and deposited it immediately. Israel began making withdrawals at ATMs across the city, convinced he was still invisible. But by hunting in his own backyard, he had finally stepped into a spotlight he couldn't escape. The moment the first dollar was withdrawn from Samantha's account, a digital dragnet was activated thousands of miles away. The FBI and the Anchorage Police Department were monitoring that debit card in real time. They weren't just waiting for pings, they were mapping the speed and direction of the user. The first withdrawal happened in Arizona, then another in New Mexico. It was clear the suspect was moving east along Interstate 10. The FBI coordinated with state troopers across the South, providing a description of a lone male in a rental car. On March 13, 2012, in Lufkin, Texas, a veteran Texas Ranger named Brian Washburn spotted a white Ford Focus in a hotel parking lot. He noticed it was parked in a combat park position, backed in for a quick getaway. He ran the plates and confirmed it was a rental out of Arizona. The Ranger set up a surveillance point and waited. After 20 minutes, a man walked out of the hotel, got into the car, and headed toward the highway. Ranger Washburn followed, waiting for a minor traffic violation to pull him over. When the driver failed to signal a turn, the lights went on. The man who pulled over was Israel Keys. He was calm, soft-spoken, and incredibly polite. He handed over his Alaska license and explained he was just on a road trip. But the ranger noticed a crumpled map on the floorboard and rolls of cash in the console. When he asked to search the car, Israel, still confident in his ability to deceive, gave his consent. He believed he had cleaned the vehicle perfectly, but as the ranger checked the side pocket of the driver's door, his fingers brushed against a small plastic card. He pulled it out and read the name, Samantha Koenig. The atmosphere in that interrogation room in Lufkin was tense. Israel initially tried to claim he had found the card in a parking lot, but the FBI team that flew in from Alaska wasn't buying it. They sat across from him and laid out the evidence: the security footage, the DNA from his shed, and the logs from the cruise ship. They watched as Israel's calm exterior finally began to crack. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man in a small room with no way out. He stopped the polite contractor act, leaned in, and told them he would talk, but only on his terms. He wanted the death penalty, and he didn't want his daughter to know what he was. Once he realized the game was over, his ego took over. He didn't show remorse. He showed pride. He began to describe a decade of horror that far exceeded anything the authorities had suspected. He told them about the Cayes in Vermont, bank robberies in New York, and the kill kits buried across the country. He spoke with a chilling level of detachment, explaining how he had hunted people like animals and outsmarted the police for years. He admitted that Samantha was just the one who finally ended his streak. He told the agents they had only seen the tip of the iceberg, and that he had been doing this for a very long time. He began to draw maps, showing them exactly where to dig to find his hidden buckets of weapons and cash, finally revealing the scale of the monster they had captured. The interrogation of Israel Keyes became a grueling psychological marathon. He wouldn't talk unless he was given specific rewards: cigars, chocolate, or a certain brand of coffee. He treated the FBI agents not as enemies, but as students who were finally learning from a master. To prove he wasn't lying, he gave them coordinates. Agents were dispatched to remote areas in several states, and in every location, they found exactly what he described: Home Depot buckets filled with high-powered rifles, silencers, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It was the physical proof of a man who had been at war with society for years. He was a prolific killer, and he wanted the agents to know exactly how much work he had put into his craft. But as the investigation moved forward, Israel's ego began to clash with the reality of the situation. He realized that as he gave up more information, he was losing his only remaining source of power. He started to toy with the investigators, giving them the names of states where he had committed murders, but refusing to provide the names of the victims or the locations of their bodies. He would laugh when they asked for more details, telling them that some secrets were for him alone. He wanted the world to know he was a legend in the dark, but he refused to give the families of his victims the closure they were desperate for. Even from behind bars, he was still playing the role of the predator, controlling the narrative until the very end. In December of 2012, the pressure of the upcoming trial and the realization that his secret life was about to be fully exposed to his family became too much for him to handle. On the night of December 2nd, Israel Keyes decided to take back the only thing he felt he still owned: his death. He had managed to hide a small piece of a razor blade inside his cell. He used it to cut his left wrist and then used a length of bedding he had fashioned into a ligature to ensure the job was finished. When the guards found him the next morning, he was gone. He left behind a suicide note that was a chilling 4-page poem titled Ode to Murder. It didn't contain an apology. It was a celebration of the darkness he had lived in for so long. Alongside the note, investigators found a piece of paper with 12 hand-drawn skulls, each one colored with his own blood. It is believed these skulls represented his victims, with the 12th representing himself. By taking his own life, Israel Keyes ensured that the full scale of his crimes would remain a mystery. The FBI spent years following up on his hunting trips, but without his guidance, many of his victims remain unidentified and unrecovered. He died exactly as he had lived, on his own terms, leaving behind a trail of silence and the unsettling truth that for years he had been exactly what he appeared to be: just another neighbor. In 1995, if you were to drive down Harrington Drive in Springfield, Illinois, you would see exactly what you'd expect from a quiet, upper-middle-class Midwest neighborhood. It was the kind of place where the lawns were perfectly edged and the neighbors all knew each other's business in a friendly, low-stakes kind of way. It was safe, it was predictable, and for Mark and Donna Winger, it was supposed to be the sanctuary where they raised their family. Mark was a 30-year-old nuclear physicist, a man whose entire life was governed by the laws of precision and logic. His wife, Donna, was an operating room technician, someone whose career was built on staying calm under immense pressure. After years of struggling with infertility, they had finally achieved their dream of becoming parents, adopting a beautiful baby girl named Bailey. They were the picture of a successful, happy young family starting their next chapter in a house that felt like a fortress against the outside world. But that sense of security began to crumble on the afternoon of August 23rd. Donna was returning home from visiting her parents in Florida and had booked a seat on an airport shuttle from St. Louis. When she finally pulled up to her house, she was visibly shaken, her face pale as she hurried inside. She told Mark that the driver, a man named Roger Harrington, had spent the entire 90-minute trip acting in a deeply disturbing manner. He didn't just drive, he ranted. He talked incessantly about having out-of-body experiences and strange, dark thoughts that made Donna feel physically unsafe in the cramped van. Mark, being the protective and analytical husband, took immediate action. He called the shuttle company and filed a formal, scathing complaint against Roger. He wanted this man nowhere near his family, believing that by involving his supervisor, he had effectively neutralized the threat and closed the door on the incident forever. For the next several days, life on Harrington Drive returned to its quiet rhythm. Mark went to work at the nuclear plant, Donna cared for the baby, and the encounter with the shuttle driver began to feel like a bizarre, one-off story. But the reality was that Mark's complaint had triggered something dark in Roger Harrington. Roger was a man whose life was already teetering on the edge. He had lost jobs before and lived in a world where he felt constantly persecuted. Receiving a formal complaint that threatened his livelihood was the final spark. While the Wingers were settling into their evening routines, Roger was elsewhere, stewing in a growing rage. He began to fixate on the address on Harrington Drive. He wasn't just some random stranger anymore. He was a man who felt he had been wronged, and he was beginning to believe that the only way to balance the scales was through a direct confrontation. On the afternoon of August 29th, a heavy, humid silence hung over Springfield. Mark had come home from work a little early, and the house was quiet. Around 4:35 p.m., Mark says he was standing in the kitchen when a sound from the dining room area shattered the stillness. It wasn't a normal house sound. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping followed by a muffled, high-pitched cry that sounded like it was being cut short. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran toward the dining room. But what he saw when he turned the corner was a scene of such intensity and chaos that his brain struggled to process it. There, in the center of the room, was the shuttle driver, Roger Harrington. He was standing over Donna, who was already slumped on the floor, and he was in the middle of a violent assault. Mark scrambled to the master bedroom, pulled his pistol from the nightstand, and rushed back into the hallway. He found Harrington still hovering over Donna and refused to stop. Mark raised the weapon and fired, hitting Harrington twice. As the man collapsed, Mark dropped to his knees, trying to check on his wife while grabbing the phone to dial 911. The recording of that call would later become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire case. You can hear the raw, guttural sobbing of a man who sounds like he is watching his entire world end. When the first officers arrived, they found a scene of total devastation. Donna was clinging to life, but was largely unresponsive, and Roger Harrington was sprawled nearby. Paramedics worked frantically, but the damage was too severe. Donna passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital, and Roger passed away on the operating table. Within hours, the police had a clear narrative: the hero husband, the innocent victim, and the vengeful driver who had come to settle a grudge. In the months following the tragedy, Mark Winger became a symbol of resilience in Springfield. He was a grieving widower who had to figure out how to raise his daughter in a house haunted by tragedy. Remarkably, Mark didn't retreat from the world. Just 5 months after Donna's passing, He hired a young woman named Rebecca Simic to be Bailey's nanny. It was a practical move that quickly turned into something more. Mark and Rebecca fell in love and were married shortly after. To everyone watching, it was a beautiful silver lining. He was the golden widower, and no one had any reason to doubt his story. But while Mark was building his new life, Detective Doug Williamson was stuck in the past. Williamson had been one of the lead investigators, and despite the hero narrative, he had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It started with Mark's behavior after the case was technically closed. Most people who experience that level of trauma want to move on, but Mark kept showing up at the station. He would drop by Williamson's office every few months just to check in or ask if there were any new developments. He seemed obsessed with making sure the case was truly, officially finished. It didn't feel like a victim seeking closure. It felt like a man checking the perimeter of a fence to make sure there were no holes. Williamson began to wonder why a nuclear physicist, a man who lived by logic and evidence, was so insecure about a case that had already been ruled in his favor. The breakthrough finally came 3 years later, in 1998, when a woman named Deanne Schultz walked into the station and asked to speak with detectives. Deanne had been Donna Winger's best friend, but as she sat down, it became clear she was carrying a weight that was physically exhausting her. She confessed that she and Mark Winger had been involved in a secret, high-intensity affair for months leading up to the tragedy. While Mark was playing the part of the happy husband, he was meeting Deanne in secret, telling her that he was miserable and that Donna was smothering him. More chillingly, Deanne claimed that Mark had mentioned several times that his life would be much easier if Donna were just gone. She had stayed silent out of fear, but seeing Mark move on so quickly with a new wife was the final straw. With this new lead, Williamson realized that the hero story might have been a carefully constructed facade. With Deanne's testimony, Detective Williamson went back to the original evidence. He wasn't looking for new suspects. He was looking at the physical reality of the dining room on the night of the incident. He pulled out the crime scene Polaroids and spent hours looking at the positions of those involved. Mark had told the police that when he burst into the room, Harrington was standing over Donna. Mark claimed he fired from the kitchen doorway, and that Harrington immediately fell back. This was the foundation of his self-defense claim. But as Williamson looked at the angles of the wounds and the way Harrington's legs were oriented with Donna's, the geometry simply didn't work. If Mark had fired from the kitchen, the trajectory didn't align with where the evidence was found. The physics suggested a much darker scenario. Based on the evidence, it appeared that Harrington had been shot from a much closer range, and from an angle that suggested he wasn't standing up at all. He might have been on his knees or already on the ground when the final shots were fired. This meant that Mark hadn't interrupted an attack in progress. He had ended the life of a man who was already incapacitated. But the most damning evidence was in the individual's own car. Williamson went back to the inventory of Roger Harrington's vehicle, which had been parked right in front of the Winger house that afternoon. Inside, sitting on the passenger seat, was a small, unassuming scrap of paper. On it was written 2305 Harrington Drive and the time 4:30 p.m. The detectives sent the note for handwriting analysis, and the results came back with total clarity. The writing belonged to Mark Winger. This one piece of paper destroyed the entire crazed stalker theory. If Roger Harrington was a man seeking a violent, random revenge, he wouldn't have had a scheduled appointment note written by the husband. He hadn't broken into the house. He had been invited. He had shown up that afternoon thinking he was meeting Mark to clear the air about the shuttle complaint. He hadn't brought a weapon with him into the house. The weapon used on Donna was one that belonged to the Wingers. Mark had lured a vulnerable man to his home at a specific time, knowing that Roger's previous behavior would make him the perfect scapegoat for a plan Mark had already decided to carry out. The detectives finally understood the terrifying genius of Mark Winger's plan. He didn't just want to take his wife's life. He wanted to be the hero of the story. He had used his analytical mind to engineer a situation that had a built-in villain. He knew Roger Harrington was someone the police would easily suspect. On that afternoon, Mark likely carried out the assault on Donna himself. Then, he waited for the doorbell to ring at 4:30 p.m., exactly when he had told Roger to show up. When the unsuspecting shuttle driver walked through the door, Mark didn't give him a chance to speak. He likely incapacitated him, then moved the individuals and the evidence to make it look like a struggle had taken place. He then placed the 911 call, performing the role of the devastated husband with such conviction that he fooled an entire city for 3 years. The motive was a combination of cold calculation and narcissism. Mark wanted out of his marriage, and he wanted to be with Deanne, but he didn't want the financial or social fallout of a divorce. He wanted the life insurance, the house, and most importantly, his image as a brilliant, protective family man. In his mind, framing Roger was a perfect solution that solved all his problems in one afternoon. He believed he was smarter than the local police, and for a long time, he was right. He had managed to marry the new nanny and start a fresh life using the sympathy he'd earned from the tragedy. But his own arrogance was his undoing. By constantly returning to the police station to check on the case, he kept the embers of the investigation burning until they finally caught fire. Mark Winger was arrested in 2001 and charged with the murders of both Donnell Winger and Roger Harrington. During the trial in 2002, the prosecution laid out the physical evidence, the affair, and the handwritten note found in Roger's car. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. The man who had been hailed as a hero was revealed to be a cold-blooded architect of tragedy. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, he remains in an Illinois prison, his perfect life replaced by a cell. Mark Winger wasn't just a husband who lost his way. He was a man who tried to write his own legend, only to realize he was missing from the world he tried to create. In July of 2014, a 28-year-old German man named Lars Mittank was doing exactly what thousands of other young Europeans do every single summer. He was on vacation. He and a group of 5 close friends had flown from their hometown in northern Germany to the Golden Sands Resort in Bulgaria. This place is famous for its massive beach parties, vibrant nightlife, and a generally carefree atmosphere. Lars was a popular guy, hardworking, a massive fan of the Werder Bremen football club, and someone his friends described as totally normal and reliable. He wasn't a big risk taker or someone who looked for trouble. For the first few days, the trip was exactly what they had hoped for. They spent their time lounging by the pool, grabbing drinks, and enjoying the sun. There was nothing in Lars's behavior that suggested anything was wrong. He was laughing, planning the next day's events, and seemed to be having the time of his life. However, the tone of the trip shifted during a night out at a local bar. Lars, a diehard football fan, got into a heated verbal disagreement with a group of fans from a rival team. It was the kind of loud, boisterous argument you see in sports bars every weekend, and eventually the groups went their separate ways. But later that night, after Lars left a restaurant alone, he was reportedly confronted by a group of men. According to Lars, these men had been hired by the football fans he'd argued with earlier. In the scuffle that followed, Lars was struck in the side of the head. When he finally made it back to his friends, he complained that his ear was ringing and he was in significant pain. The next morning, a local doctor confirmed that Lars had suffered a ruptured eardrum. Because of the change in cabin pressure during a flight, the doctor advised Lars not to fly home with his friends. He needed to stay behind for a few extra days until the injury stabilized. Lars's friends offered to stay with him, but Lars insisted they head home. He told them he'd be fine for a few days on his own. He'd see a specialist, and then he'd catch a later flight. It seemed like a minor, albeit annoying, inconvenience. As his friends boarded their plane back to Germany, they waved goodbye to Lars, expecting to see him in a few days. Lars checked into a hotel called the Hotel Viva near the airport to wait out the mandatory rest period. But as soon as he was alone, something in Lars's psyche seemed to change. The calm, reliable young man his friends knew vanished. He began calling his mother back in Germany in the middle of the night, whispering into the phone. He told her that he felt like he was being watched, that people were following him, and that he didn't feel safe in the hotel. He sounded terrified, a complete contrast to the person who had been joking on the beach just 48 hours earlier. By the early morning hours of July 8th, Lars's paranoia had reached a breaking point. He told his mother that 4 men were following him and that he was hiding in the hotel. He eventually fled the building, wandering the streets of Varna in the dark. convinced that he was being hunted. When the sun finally came up, he made his way to the Varna airport. This was the day he was supposed to finally fly home. To anyone watching, he looked like a standard traveler. He had his backpack and a yellow duffel bag, and he walked into the terminal looking tired but functional. He headed straight to the airport's medical center to get one final checkup from the flight physician, Dr. Kostakostov, to ensure his ear could handle the flight. Inside the small medical office, Lars sat down and began talking to the doctor. Dr. Kostov later reported that Lars seemed nervous but was otherwise coherent. However, the situation took a bizarre turn when a construction worker entered the room to perform some routine maintenance. The moment Lars saw the man in the uniform, he froze. His eyes went wide, and he started trembling. He allegedly turned to the doctor and whispered, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." Before the doctor could even respond, Lars stood up and bolted out of the office. He didn't grab his backpack. He didn't grab his duffel bag. He didn't grab his wallet or his cell phone. He just ran. The airport's closed-circuit television cameras captured what happened next, and it is some of the most haunting footage ever recorded in a public space. The video shows Lars sprinting through the terminal. He isn't looking back. He is running with a level of intensity that suggests he is fleeing for his life. He exits the terminal doors and continues running across the parking lot. He doesn't slow down to ask for help or look for a taxi. He keeps going until he reaches a high, barbed wire fence that surrounds the airport perimeter. In the footage, Lars can be seen scaling the fence with remarkable speed, seemingly unbothered by the wire at the top. He jumps down on the other side and disappears into a dense field of sunflowers and woods beyond the airport grounds. This was the last time anyone ever saw Lars Mittank. When Lars failed to board his flight and his belongings were found abandoned in the medical center, the Bulgarian authorities were notified. Initially, they thought it might be a case of a young tourist having a temporary breakdown or perhaps a reaction to medication. Lars had been prescribed an antibiotic called cefuroxime for his ear infection, and some wondered if a rare side effect had caused his sudden onset of paranoia. However, as the days turned into weeks, the search became much more urgent. Lars's mother hired private investigators and flew to Bulgaria to help coordinate the effort. They handed out thousands of flyers, searched the woods near the airport, and spoke to dozens of witnesses, but the trail was cold. The area where Lars disappeared was a massive, sprawling landscape of agricultural fields and thick forests. It was the height of summer, and the sunflowers were tall enough to hide a man standing upright. Search teams used drones and heat-seeking cameras, but they found nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded clothing, and no more sightings. The private investigators began to look into the four men Lars claimed were following him. They checked the hotel security footage and spoke to the staff, but they found no evidence of anyone stalking Lars. It appeared that the threat he was fleeing was entirely internal, yet the physical result was very real. Lars was gone, leaving behind all the tools he would need to survive or travel. The case began to gain international attention, largely because of the airport footage. People across the globe were fascinated by the image of a young man who looked completely normal one moment and was fleeing a phantom threat the next. Theories began to circulate online. Some believed Lars had been caught up in an organized crime ring, while others thought he might have suffered a head injury during the initial scuffle that caused a slow-building issue in his brain. The most tragic theory was that Lars had simply wandered into the woods in a state of distress and succumbed to the elements. But Bulgaria in July is not an easy place to disappear without a trace. It is a populated area, and the fact that no remains were found after months of intensive searching only added to the mystery. Months turned into years, and Lars Mittank became a permanent fixture on missing persons lists across Europe. Every few months, a new lead would emerge. Someone would claim to have seen a man matching Lars's description living as a transient in a different city, or a grainy photo would surface of a hitchhiker in another country. In 2016, a man was found wandering along a highway in Brazil with no memory of who he was. For a few frantic days, the internet was convinced it was Lars, but fingerprint records eventually identified the man as someone else. Lars's mother refused to give up hope, maintaining a social media presence that kept her son's face in the public eye. She believed that Lars was out there somewhere, perhaps living with amnesia or in a state where he didn't realize people were looking for him. The investigation into the medical side of the case continued as well. Experts looked into the possibility that the combination of the head injury, the ear infection, and the specific antibiotic he was taking could have triggered a neurological reaction. Cefuroxime is a common drug, but in extremely rare cases, it has been linked to acute episodes of distress and hallucinations. If Lars was already stressed and suffering from a concussion, the medication might have pushed him over the edge. But even if that explained why he ran, it didn't explain where he went. A man in a state of distress still needs food and water. He still leaves a physical footprint. The fact that he vanished so completely suggested either a deliberate effort to stay hidden or a series of events that took him far away from the initial search area. The Bulgarian police eventually moved the case to their cold files, though they insisted they would follow any new leads. The private investigators hired by the family continued to work, focusing on the possibility that Lars had boarded a truck or a freight train. Varna is a major port city with a lot of international transport. If Lars had climbed into a shipping container or the back of a long-haul truck in his panic state, he could have ended up hundreds of miles away in a matter of hours. This theory kept the hope alive that he was still out there, but it also made the search area impossibly large. Today, over a decade after he scaled that fence, Lars Mittank remains the subject of countless documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. The airport footage is still picked apart frame by frame. People study the construction worker who stepped into the doctor's office. They watch the travelers in the background. They replay the moment Lars reaches the fence over and over, hoping something will finally stand out. But the footage never gives them what they need. It shows how he disappeared, not where he went. For his family, the silence never lifted. They never held a memorial. There was no body, no confirmation, nothing to grieve. Just a constant pull between two possibilities. That he is still out there somewhere, or that something happened in those woods beyond the airport, and they will never know which. Lars' story turns on a single moment. One minute, he was on a beach with friends, talking about football, planning his trip home. The next, something shifted, something no one else could see. And from that point on, nothing made sense. There are no confirmed suspects, no evidence of a larger plot, no clear reason for what happened. Just a man who became afraid and ran. As of today, there have been no credible sightings, no remains, no answers. His belongings still sit in evidence. Clothes, souvenirs, the small pieces of a trip that was supposed to end at home. They are all that's left of that version of him. Lars walked into an airport to leave Bulgaria. Instead, he walked out his own life and never came back. There is a particular kind of darkness that moves into a home without making a sound. It doesn't kick down the door or announce itself. It arrives through a screen at 2 a.m. in the blue glow of a bedroom nobody is supposed to be awake in. That is how it arrived in the Amato home in Chulwoda, Florida. This wasn't a place of high drama or flashing lights. It was a neighborhood of winding roads, manicured lawns, and a sense of shared security. At the heart of this community, on a street called Sultan Circle, lived the Amato family. Chad Amato, 59, was the patriarch, a man who had spent decades building a stable, upper-middle-class life for his family. He was known as a disciplined, hard-working father who took immense pride in the achievements of his three sons. His wife, Margaret, 61, was the emotional glue of the home, a woman who doted on her children and worked as a dedicated pharmacist. Together, they had raised three sons: Jason, the eldest, Grant, the middle child, and Cody, the youngest. On the surface, the Amatos were the gold standard of success. They were educated, professional, and appeared to be a united front against the world. Grant Amato, 29, was arguably the one the family was currently most focused on. He was a nurse anesthetist student, a prestigious and demanding career path that required a high degree of intelligence and moral character. In the medical world, a nurse anesthetist is a position of extreme trust responsible for the lives of patients in their most vulnerable states. Grant seemed to be checking all the boxes for a successful life, but by late 2018, a hidden rot had begun to eat away at his focus. It didn't start with a traditional addiction like substances or gambling. It started with a laptop screen. Grant had discovered a live streaming site, and specifically, he had become obsessed with a performer based in Bulgaria. What might have started as a fleeting curiosity quickly spiraled into a total psychological takeover. Grant wasn't just watching. He was participating in a high-stakes digital fantasy where he could pretend to be anyone he wanted to be. To the performer in Bulgaria, Grant wasn't a struggling student living at home. He was a high-rolling benefactor. To maintain this facade, Grant needed tokens, and tokens cost money, staggering amounts of it. He began spending thousands of dollars every week to keep the performer's attention, often staying awake for 24 hours straight just to be in her private chat rooms. When his own savings were exhausted, the logic of the addict took over. He began to systematically steal from his own family. He didn't just take a few $100s. He drained his brother Jason's investment accounts, redirected his own tuition money, and eventually began taking out loans in his parents' names. By the time the House of Cards collapsed in early 2019, the prosecution argued that Grant had funneled more than $200,000 of Amato family wealth into a digital void. The discovery of this theft was a physical blow to Chad and Margaret. They hadn't just lost their retirement savings. They had lost the son they thought they knew. Despite the betrayal, the Amatos didn't call the police. In a move that highlights their deep, perhaps tragic, love for their son, they tried to fix him. They viewed Grant's behavior as a mental health crisis, an internet addiction, that could be cured with the right intervention. They paid for him to attend a voluntary retreat at a facility in Fort Lauderdale that specialized in gaming and internet dependency. For 2 weeks, Grant was offline, forced to confront the reality of what he had done to his family. When he returned home to Sultan's Circle in mid-January, he told his parents exactly what they wanted to hear. He claimed he was cured, that he saw the performer for what she was, and that he was ready to rebuild his life. But as Grant walked back into his childhood bedroom, he wasn't thinking about redemption. He was thinking about how to get back online. The digital pull wasn't just a habit. For Grant, that screen was the only place where he felt powerful, and the state suggested he was willing to burn down his real life to get back to it. The week leading up to January 24th, 2019, was defined by a fragile, artificial peace inside the Amato home. Chad Amato was not a man who allowed for ambiguity. If Grant was going to stay under his roof, there had to be an absolute structure. Chad drafted a list of conditions that were non-negotiable. Grant was to have no contact with a Bulgarian woman. He was to have no unsupervised internet access. And he was required to find a job to begin the long, likely impossible task of paying back the $200,000. For Grant, these rules were more than just boundaries. They were prison. He spent his days in a house where the air was thick with unspoken resentment. He would watch his father go to work, his mother tend to the house, and his younger brother, Cody, return home from successful shifts as a nurse at the local hospital. Grant was the outcast, the one who had brought shame to the Sultan's Circle address, and he was being watched like a prisoner in his own home. On the night of January 24th, the structure finally collapsed. Chad Amato, who had become a self-taught expert in monitoring the home's digital traffic, discovered that Grant had broken the primary rule. Grant had used a hidden device to bypass the family's router filters. He hadn't just checked the site. He had reached out to the performer in Bulgaria again, begging for her attention and, incredibly, trying to find ways to send her more money. When Chad confronted him, the argument was explosive. Chad had spent his life building a fortress for his family, and he finally realized that the threat was coming from inside the walls. He gave Grant a final, definitive ultimatum. Pack your things and get out tonight. There would be no more retreats, no more second chances, and no more chances to steal from the people who loved him. Grant was being severed from the family's resources and, by extension, from his digital life. What happened in the hours following that argument would remain a mystery until the physical evidence began to tell the story. The house on Sultan's Circle fell into a deep, unnatural silence. Neighbors didn't report hearing shouts or gunfire. The suburban night was as still as any other. But inside, the evidence suggests a purpose that was entirely divorced from reality. Grant's resentment had curdled into something far more dangerous than simple anger. In the narrative presented by the state, his father wasn't a man trying to save his family. He was a gatekeeper who had cut off Grant's access to the only world that mattered. As the lights went out in the neighborhood, the Amato home became a crime scene in waiting. Grant wasn't packing a suitcase to leave. The prosecution argued he was preparing to remove the obstacles that stood between him and his computer. The following morning, January 25th, the world outside Sultan's circle continued as normal, but the absence of the Amatos began to create ripples of concern. Cody Amato was a respected nurse at Advent Health Orlando, a man known for his punctuality and dedication. When his 7 a.m. shift began and Cody wasn't there, his coworkers didn't just assume he was running late. They knew Cody wouldn't leave his patients or his team hanging. They called his phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By 9 a.m., the concern turned to genuine fear. They called the Seminole County Sheriff's Office and requested a welfare check at the house. When the deputy arrived at the home, he found the property looking exactly as it always did. The grass was mowed, the cars were in the driveway, and the house was locked tight. But when he peered through a window, he saw a sight that changed the welfare check into a homicide investigation. He saw a man slumped on the floor, and the amount of blood visible made it clear that this wasn't a medical emergency. It was an execution. When the tactical teams breached the house on Sultan Circle, they expected to find a struggle, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. Instead, they found a house that had been turned into a scene of unimaginable violence. In the master bedroom, they found 59-year-old Chad Amato. He had been shot multiple times, with evidence suggesting he had been caught completely off guard, possibly while preparing for bed or resting. In the kitchen, the team found 61-year-old Margaret Amato. She was sitting at her desk, her body slumped over the computer where she had likely been checking emails or finishing work for the pharmacy. She hadn't even had time to stand up. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was in the hallway. 31-year-old Cody Amato was found lying near the entrance, still dressed in his medical scrubs. He had just finished a long shift helping others, only to walk through his own front door and be met with a fatal ambush. The detectives on the scene noticed something that suggested a level of coldness that was hard to comprehend. The bodies hadn't just been left where they fell. There were signs that someone had stayed in the house for hours after the shootings. There were attempts to cover the bodies with towels and blankets, a common sign in forensic psychology of a killer who knows the victims and cannot bear to look at their faces. But more importantly, the house was missing its middle son. Grant Amato's white Honda was gone, and his bedroom was empty of its most essential item, his laptop. The search for Grant became a massive, multi-county manhunt. The police knew that Grant was dangerous, but they also knew he was predictable. He was a man who couldn't stay away from the digital world for long. They began tracking his cell phone pings and eventually located his car at a hotel in Orange County. The arrest of Grant Amato was surprisingly quiet. There was no shootout, no dramatic standoff. When the SWAT team swarmed his hotel room, they found Grant sitting in a chair, looking almost bored. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his entire family. He looked like a man who was waiting for a bus. As they took him into custody, they found that he had already been attempting to log back onto the internet. Even with his family lying in a morgue and the police at his door, Grant's primary concern was his digital standing. When he was brought into the interrogation room, the detectives expected a confession fueled by guilt or a breakdown. Instead, Grant sat across from them and began a calm, articulate performance that lasted for hours. He spoke about his family in the past tense with a disturbing ease, but he saved his most intense emotions for the Bulgarian performer. Grant's story to the detectives was a masterpiece of redirection. He admitted to the theft and the addiction, but he tried to paint himself as the primary victim of the household. He described his father's rules not as boundaries, but as psychological abuse. He claimed that on the night of the 24th, after the argument, he had simply left the house in a fit of frustration and spent the night driving around and staying at the hotel to clear his head. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to his parents and brother, but the detectives were watching his body language. When they showed him photos of the crime scene, Grant didn't cry. He didn't look away in horror. He studied the photos with a clinical, detached interest, as if he were looking at an anatomy textbook rather than the bodies of the people who had raised him. He was a nurse anesthetist student. After all, he knew how to look at a body without emotion. The case against Grant Amato moved toward trial in late 2019, and it became one of the most high-profile examples of how digital obsession can manifest as physical violence. The prosecution strategy was built on a mountain of digital evidence. They didn't just have the $200,000 in stolen funds. They had the metadata. They could show exactly when Grant was online, exactly what he was saying to the performer in Bulgaria, and, most crucially, what he did in the hours after his family was killed. The records showed that while his father and mother were lying in the house, Grant was attempting to communicate with a woman on the adult streaming platform. He was trying to explain away his sudden lack of funds, promising her that he would have more soon. He was already planning his new life before the bodies of his family were even cold. The defense tried to leverage the fact that the murder weapon had never been found. They argued that there was no DNA on the shell casings and that the state's case was entirely circumstantial. They suggested that an unknown intruder with no connection to the family could have entered the home and carried out the attacks. But the circumstantial evidence was an avalanche. The prosecution pointed to the handwritten note found in Grant's possession, a series of login credentials and financial plans that showed a man completely untethered from reality. They also brought in the lone survivor of the Amato family, Jason, the eldest brother. Jason's testimony was a gut-wrenching account of a family that had done everything right, only to be destroyed by a brother who viewed them as ATMs rather than human beings. As the trial progressed, the psychological profile of Grant Amato began to emerge. The prosecution argued he wasn't a man who had snapped in a moment of rage, but a man who had performed a cold, logical calculation. In Grant's mind, the state argued he had two options. He could live a life of shame, working a low-paying job to pay back a debt he could never satisfy, or he could remove the people holding the debt and start over. He believed that with his parents and Cody gone, he would inherit the house and the remaining life insurance policies. He thought he could turn the Sultan Circle home into a private studio where he could live out his digital fantasy forever. He didn't see the murders as a tragedy. The state argued he saw them as a business reorganization. The level of narcissism required to believe he could get away with such a blatant crime in a quiet suburb was the very thing that made him so dangerous. The jury only needed a few hours of deliberation. The evidence of the digital descent was too clear to ignore. In July 2019, Grant Amato was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase was a formality, but it provided a platform for the community to express their collective horror. The judge, in his final remarks, noted that he had seen many violent crimes in his career, but the coldness displayed by Grant Amato was unique. He was a man who had been given every advantage, a loving home, an expensive education, and multiple chances at redemption. And he had traded it all for a handful of digital tokens and a stranger's attention. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the only world he would see for the rest of his life was the gray reality of a Florida prison cell. Today, the house on Sultan Circle is just another home in Chiliota, but for those who know the story, it remains a monument to a modern form of madness. The tragedy of the Amato family is a stark reminder that the most dangerous addictions aren't always the ones we can see in a person's eyes or track through physical symptoms. Grant Amato's addiction was invisible because it lived in the glow of a monitor. He was a man who had successfully navigated the real world for nearly 30 years, earning a degree and entering a specialized medical field, all while a secret life was slowly hollowing him out. By the time his family realized the scale of the problem, it was already too late. The person they were trying to save had already been replaced by a digital ghost. Grant Amato remains in the Florida Department of Corrections, and by all accounts, he has maintained the same detached stoic demeanor that he displayed throughout his trial. He has never expressed genuine remorse for the lives of Chad, Margaret, or Cody. To him, the story ended the moment the police took his laptop. Without the screen, Grant has no identity. He is a man who exists in a void, a prisoner not just of the state, but of the own logic he used to justify the murders. He still views himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who is simply trying to find happiness in a world that didn't understand his relationship. The performer in Bulgaria, for her part, has remained a footnote in the case, a woman who was inadvertently the catalyst for a massacre she had no part in. The case is frequently studied by investigators as a warning about the intersection of social media, digital parasocial relationships, and domestic violence. It highlights a terrifying reality of the 21st century, that a person can be physically present in a room with their family while their mind is thousands of miles away, being groomed by an obsession that values pixels over blood. The Amato family did what any good family would do. They offered support, they offered money, and they offered a second chance. But they didn't realize they were bargaining with a shadow. The prosecution's case was that Grant didn't kill his family because he hated them. He killed them because they were the only things left that were real, and in Grant Amato's world, reality was the enemy. The story of Sultan's Circle ends not with a grand revelation, but with a lingering question about the digital age. How many other perfect homes have a glow coming from under a bedroom door at 3 a.m.? How many other families are one ultimatum away from a tragedy they can't see coming? The Amatos were a family built on the values of the past: hard work, education, and loyalty. They were destroyed by a son who had fully embraced a hollow future. As the sun sets over Chiliota, the neighborhood is as quiet as it was on the night of January 24th, a silence that serves as the only remaining witness to the day the digital world finally broke through the front door. If you want more real cases like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.